Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Enberg, Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence. It's so nice to see all of you again. Thank you for joining us for our Ask the Analysts live audience Q&A. I'm joined by my colleagues here in New York. We have Susie David Canyon, Vice President of Content, Retail, and E-commerce, Jeremy Goldman, Senior Director of Marketing, Retail, and Tech Briefings, and Ethan Kramer-Flood, Senior Forecasting Writer. Throughout the day, you've sat on panels about the outlook for retail media, CTV, social, data, the list goes on. We would love to answer your questions on those topics, but we'd also love to answer any other burning questions you have on the broader retail and digital marketing landscape. You can submit questions using the chat window on the right, and make sure you also let us know where you're tuning in from. I'd also like to thank Walmart Connect for making today's live audience Q&A possible. But with that, let's get started. I'm going to kick things off with a few really great questions that we received during our sessions earlier today. So our first question is, what are some of the emerging trends in omnichannel retail, and how can retailers stay ahead of those trends? Jeremy, Susie, I'll throw it over to you.
Awesome. So, I think it's such a broad question. It depends on how we're thinking about the interpretation. In terms of channels, I think we're starting to see a little bit more around car commerce and around voice commerce, and especially with ChatGPT, we have a feeling that might start to get a little bit better with generative AI. From the idea around omnichannel, we talk about this all the time in terms of it's more than just two channels, the original online desktop and the store, but there are lots of other channels now, and everything from social commerce to live streaming, to mobile commerce. The list goes on and on. I'd say probably the biggest emerging trends is the car commerce piece. As cars start to become more and more connected, I think we're going to start to see that a little bit more. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I also think another thing that's really interesting is the fact that you increasingly, as a retailer, have so many different things that you have to be managing. And of course, nobody says you're going to have 80% more headcount in order to deal with this. So to some extent, you have to do a bit of triage work and try to figure out where actually your customer is and what are some of these things that you're going to really sink your resources into, because you can't be everywhere at once.
I think that's a great point, right? We talk a lot about being authentic to your brand and going in the direction where your customer already is. And I think, Jasmine, you probably have a really good perspective on that when it comes to TikTok commerce, right? And just social commerce in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Authenticity, I think, is one of the key words, also a little bit of a buzzword when it comes to social commerce and TikTok and creators in general. But, it is a channel that has received a lot of dismissal over the past several months. And, it's one that's still going through trial and error. And there's certainly been a lot of changes within social commerce, but I would say that despite all the noise around it, it's still an incredibly important sales and marketing channel. We are seeing now that, a lot of the activations around social commerce on Instagram in particular are going to be more centered around advertising. But when it comes to TikTok, they're forging full steam ahead with commerce. And commerce really has been the cornerstone of their monetization ambitions from the get-go. And they have a really strong roadmap in China, which, Ethan, I'm sure you can speak a little bit more about.
Yeah, I imagine they have more faith than everybody else due to the previously existing massive success of Douyin, their sister organization under ByteDance. But yeah, no, thanks for tossing it over to me. I'm actually, a bit of a ringer here in terms of retail media advertising. I'm the forecast guru. And as such, I understand why everyone has been talking about it all day, because the forecast is really spectacular. The growth is sort of unbelievable, and the magnitude of dollars that have compiled over the past few years and are set to is really speaks for itself in terms of why this is a priority. But my secret agenda is to expand the conversation into e-commerce in general, because I think that's the sort of the state of e-commerce. And I promise I will use China to get my point off as quickly as I can. But the state of the sort of e-commerce and the way that it has changed a bit last year and into this year, and as we've seen these sort of structural shifts around the world, maybe as embodied by what we've seen in China, is a conversation I think that should be happening in parallel with the excitement over retail media, because of course the purpose of all this effort and expenditure in retail media is to leverage and access all this digital spending that's happening on e-commerce. So in China, I think if you were going to summarize what's going on recently as of last year and this year, it's basically just what happened. Is you're talking about a country that used to be overwhelmingly the driver of e-commerce on a global scale, and its growth has really cratered both in terms of retail sales and e-commerce. Social still doing okay, but not great, not anything to really write home about. Still maybe just slightly double digits. Live streaming, that's still a story. I think live streaming e-commerce in China is still set to grow at the 20% range, and that magic 20% figure is extraordinarily rare across many of the digital metrics that we're tracking, and probably why we're talking about retail media, because it's one of those few that's still growing at 20% and actually even accelerating. But in the rest of the world, we've really seen this shift, this downshift in a lot of what's happened with e-commerce. And we can talk about over the next half hour some of the ramifications of that and how to think about it in terms of people's outlook and intentions with regard to retail media. But for China, it has been for a long time this beacon of what's next, and that has really started to change. And in fact, its growth figures have become a drag on the global scale. So things are shifting all around us.
So sticking with the theme of TikTok in China, one other question that came in, and one that I am personally interested in hearing all of the panelists' answers to, is if TikTok is more broadly banned in the US, and it's a big if, where does the panel feel the majority of TikTok ad spend by brands would shift to?
I think that's really interesting, because I think even if it's banned in that, right now we're not talking about banned as much as we're talking about government officials have to take it off their government work phones, right? And there's the 1 hour sort of time limit for kids under 18. So I think there's still a spot for TikTok today. If it's outright banned, then I think it's going to be different platforms. And I mean, Jasmine, you probably know this better than we do. It's a younger consumer base, right? And there are new platforms that are coming out, like Be Real, which brands are trying to think about how to monetize. So there will be another TikTok that will come for sure.
But I also I think it's only fair, as Susie's alluding to think about, what is the likelihood of this happening, right? I think the likelihood is actually quite low. I think that there's a little bit of, not to say fear mongering, it's more so about there are, some geopolitical tensions, and that's part of the story right now. In terms of the odds of an outright ban, I would have to say low, but to answer the question, I think that YouTube, particularly with Shorts, would probably be a major beneficiary. I also think Instagram, and to a lesser extent, probably Netflix.
And I would agree with all of those, but I would also add retail media to that mix. I mean, TikTok has been doing a lot in terms of its lower funnel ad formats. And I think that there is, quite a few advertisers that will start experimenting more on retail media with, TikTok budgets. Should it be banned? I tend to agree with you, Jeremy and Susie. I don't expect there to be an outright ban, but, in this theoretical scenario, I do think that would be one potential beneficiary. So one question that has come in live, and that kind of, jumps off of a couple of the things that we talked about already, is how does the use of AI and machine learning impact the effectiveness of retail media campaigns?
So I think it's probably, there are two things, right? There's the original AI that everybody talks about, and then under that umbrella is generative AI. So I think it depends on what this person is referring to. But generally speaking, AI helps with bringing a ton of data into one space and making it easier, sort of like this machine learning of helping synthesize data. So by default, it'll certainly make the campaigns more efficient, which would then reduce costs, which would make each campaign a little bit more margin positive. But I would be curious to see what other folks think.
And I would just add to that, it's a really important point that ultimately programmatic and AI-based advertising is getting more effective, right? And that's great for retail media, but it is also important to note that non-retail media advertising, social media advertising, search advertising, is also leaning into AI in order to become more effective. So then to me, the question is this something that just becomes table stakes and every single major advertising lever or channel just essentially benefits a similar amount?
Yeah, I think, you know what I would add to that, speaking in return to what you're saying in terms of, I think what'll help the most is that now all of these different platforms have so much data, and it's bringing it all together to have that one view of the customer that is so hard for retailers to do right now. So having all these different mechanisms and channels with all this different data, AI certainly will help versus an individual trying to put it all together.
So speaking of having all of these different channels, one question that we got is, generally speaking, how many different endpoints are retailers juggling? Out of home, digital video, display, audio, print, and how are they able to do this on their own?
I would say they're not able to do it on their own. Largely, there's a major question that's happening right now with a lot of retailers about how much do they insource versus outsource, and how can they leverage essentially one major campaign and then create assets for so many different channels simultaneously. And that's very difficult because I think we've all seen this is, you just try to run a certain type of creative in one channel versus another, or in one geographic market versus another. And it's very difficult. So to some extent, it goes back to what we were talking about before, and making sure that what you do is very strategic, and accepting to some extent that, listen, we're going to be over leveraged in one area, and as a result, we can't do that really great Pinterest activation that we had always wanted to do.
And I think it's also, the customer shopping journey is not quite as linear anymore. And as you've been studying in social, Jasmine, you see the consumer is getting sort of researching, getting inspired, making a decision all in one session, all in one platform. So as you think about the different ways of advertising, I think you also need to think about the customer journey and where you're going to meet them, and make sure that when you're thinking about your KPIs, it's not just about, oh, this particular medium equaled this much sales, because sometimes it's hard to measure how much inspiration came from one particular advertising channel.
Absolutely. Ethan, we got one live question that is specifically for you, and it says that the forecasting growth of retail media is huge. How are you thinking about e-commerce traffic in 2023, but also over the next 5 years?
Yeah, great. That is right up my alley. Yeah, I'll just reiterate. I'm looking at the numbers right now. We're showing 20.5% growth for retail media ad spending this year, 22.9%, actually accelerating into next year. There's almost nothing that we track that is still showing a future outlook involved with acceleration. But the e-commerce side of the coin does, I don't want to say that the news is negative. In fact, we're showing some strength in retail e-commerce thanks to our internal assumption that the US is going to successfully achieve something of a soft landing, that inflation is by the second half going to get somewhat under control, and that fears of a recession are going to recede, at least somewhat, in the US market, thus leading to a very, very marginal rebound in the outlook for e-commerce overall. However, things have changed considerably compared to the story that we had been telling for the last 10 years, when e-commerce itself was perennially a 20% or more growth driver along with digital ad spending. And then, of course, this spectacular boom in 2020, 2021 that then sort of fell off a cliff across all of the metrics that we're tracking. So what is going to come back? How much of the so-called revenge of brick and mortar is a one-year phenomenon, and then things will somewhat get back to normal this year and beyond? We don't know, but the scale of the growth is not going to be what it was before. I mean, this is just a reality. That doesn't mean that things are in bad shape. It just means that the surge that we used to see year by year in almost every single product category, isn't going to happen. So you're going to have to be a little bit more careful and anticipating, what are you advertising? What product category are you in, or subcategory are you in? What is the outlook for digital sales? How many people are engaging with this? How many people are, in fact, sticking with brick and mortar or returning to their previous patterns? And how is this playing out around the rest of the world? Right? This is my favorite topic. This is actually this worldwide shift and this it's a paradigm change that happened in 2022, where e-commerce actually lost ground in about a dozen countries, something that we had never seen before. It outright declined in the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, and in 9 other countries. Brick and mortar's revenge was, it's not to say that the outcomes were bad, it's just that people's surge back into stores was so significant that e-commerce actually lost share in the overall retail pie that it obviously never happened in history anywhere, and it happened in a lot of places last year. So now we got to keep an eye on this going forward, right? I mean, if you're planning your budgets and you're trying to figure out how much is going to transact through these channels, and that's where your ad dollars are going, it's a little bit you got to be more careful than maybe in the past when everything was a winner.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to shift gears just a little bit and talk to you, Susie, but also the rest of you about loyalty and paid membership programs. We got one question which asks, what is the innovation in this space today?
This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm so glad someone was asking about it, and definitely chime in because I think everybody has a different experience around loyalty. So first, I would start to think about it as 2 completely different things, right? Membership programs, a little bit like Netflix or any other sort of thing that you're paying, gym memberships where you're paying. So here in retail, obviously, it's Walmart and Amazon and a few others that have these paid membership programs where you are paying to get extra things, right? And so by default, that gives loyalty because since you're paying for something, you're going to want to get it over and over again and use it as much as you can. But the more interesting ones for me, I think, are the ones that are not paid, like the Starbucks one with the NFT. So there's the innovation, right? Starbucks is using NFTs to try and figure out how to get people to come back and to gamify so that you do choose Starbucks and not, for example, Dunkin' Donuts or your local brand. I think the other thing is thinking about how do you make it so easy for the consumer to collect their rewards and delight them. But in this time of high inflation and economic uncertainty, how do you really add value for the customer so that they choose you and not someone else? So maybe that's special discounting, maybe it's doing special events before everybody else with better pricing, or, you know, we know some of the sneaker companies do drops before everybody else has access to for their loyalty members. So I think, again, it all depends on, yes, a little bit overused word, authentic, but understanding who your consumer is and doing the right thing for them, I think is really where, I mean, it's kind of back to basics. The innovation is back to basics, and then using technology to fuel some of that, like NFTs, or, you know, your mobile app is another really important lever to pull when it comes to loyalty and trying to make sure that it's super smooth and easy. And again, it doesn't feel very innovative necessarily, but you'd be surprised at how few retailers are doing that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that consumers are, like the data shows, they're a little bit more cautious about what data they're giving up and why. So it's not necessarily an innovation, but I have seen companies with their loyalty programs make greater attempts to try to be clear about, we're asking for this for a specific reason, as opposed to just collecting data for data's sake and then figuring out if you're ever going to do something with it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite loyalty program, Susie or Jeremy or Ethan?
You know, we just talked about this on the podcast, so I'm not going to say the same one. It's the local coffee shop, but I was getting, sorry, this is very girly, but I was getting my nails done at a salon I normally don't go to. And they had this little like signage that said, you know, join our membership program. And then for 10 points, you get a 10-minute free massage. And what I really liked about it was just about how much you're spending, and you get points for how much you're spending, but it seemed so attainable. So I, of course, went and asked, how do you get 10 points for a 10-minute massage, which is not a lot of money, but it just felt like a really easily attainable something. For if you're in New York or another very large city, you probably go pretty often. So it's so easy to go to your local place and have a redemption program that is very easy to use. So that's my new favorite.
Yeah, I first of all, no free advertising. So I'm not going to name anything because no one's sponsoring me. No one's telling me to, no one's asked me, given me any incentive. But I'm certainly a participant in those kinds of programs vastly more than I used to be. Right, I think we probably all would say that.
Yeah.
So they're working.
Well, and that's the thing, right? The easier you make it for the consumer, it's like when I was growing up, well, not even growing up, when I was in my 20s, it was like the Subway card where you bought 6 half Subways and then you got a free one, or the coffee place where you bought 8 cups of coffee and you got the 9th one free. Remember, there was a card, you just got a stamp on it. So now, we're a little bit more sophisticated, and consumers don't want to carry those cards around with them because you just never know when you're going to go to that store. So a lot of it is activated against your credit card. And so that makes it super simple. And you don't have to be a big brand to have some sort of loyalty program that makes sense for your consumer base.
And you can also, by the way, make it fun. There are some I'm with Ethan, no free advertising, but I will say that there are a few that essentially have gamified their loyalty programs. There are a number that have kind of like spin a wheel kind of technology that allows you to log on every day or once a week and then you get a spin and you get certain points that can go towards things. So essentially making loyalty fun is something that consumers increasingly look for.
So speaking a little bit about gamifying and fun and the future, is the metaverse dead? It was so hyped up just a few years back or even last year. But how should we be thinking about it now?
Or is it, this is one, again, this is one, we talked about this yesterday, we had an event at the office.
Mm-hmm.
I think, so I have a different definition of, I personally am not a user or the right consumer base for the metaverse. However, I do think for brands, it's an important place to be. I think you need to set aside a budget. I think you need to have the right KPIs. You are not going to get sales directly attributed to the metaverse experiences that you're putting together. But brands, luxury, beauty brands, even some of the more, vertically integrated brands like Gaps and Tommy Hilfigers of the world are going into the metaverse, and they're doing some very neat things. Like the latest example I heard earlier this year, which I thought was fascinating, was this dual sort of metaverse in real life attempt where a brand was doing a runway show at New York Fashion Week and had avatars at the runway show, but also showcase the runway show in, I think it was Roadblocks, but in one of the platforms that's doing the metaverse. So I think understanding, again, who is your customer? Where can you reach them? How can you reach them? And then thinking about the space as a place to educate, to entertain, to delight, and hopefully that'll lead to a sale.
There's definitely also a lot of people who were a bit hyperbolic in terms of, a certain company changed their name and now all of a sudden the metaverse is going to be here and be 20% of our revenue the next year. And that's not necessarily the case. That doesn't mean it won't be a thing. It just means that there are some people who got the time horizon wrong. So you really kind of have to think to some extent, if you're a retailer, what is next generation? What does that look like? And I agree to some extent it's a brand awareness play, but eventually sales will come in through a platform like this. And there are consumers who want to be met that way, but it's certainly not everybody. But frankly, when you mention Roblox, the fact that there are a number of different companies that are going back to do repeated activations with Roblox and Decentraland, what that says is that they're learning things that are very valuable and they're doubling down on it. That tells us something.
Right. It's that elusive customer, that young customer, right?
Yeah, and I it's not dead, I think. And the word metaverse has become a loaded term. It means different things to different people. But on the quantitative side, we do have some metrics coming out, a new forecast that I was just reviewing this week. It'll publish maybe next week, the week after, on VR and AR users, right? So this can sort of serve as a proxy for whatever may or may not eventually happen with the metaverse. You need people to actually engage with this kind of stuff. And it's still going, it's still growing. It's not growing like gangbusters, but if you look at the numbers that we have, they will either seem very small or very large, depending on what your perspective is and what your expectations were. But something like 12.5%, I can't remember the exact figure, of US consumers engage with this kind of stuff every single month on the VR side, or have, bought and used one of the headsets. And obviously AR is much higher than that because it's so easy to be an AR user with the social media apps and just playing around and stuff. It's a much lower barrier to entry. But the amount of people doing this kind of thing on a monthly basis, using these technologies, engaging with this stuff on a monthly basis continues to grow. Not at a massive clip, but it's still growing, and it's a lot of people. So yeah, it's not gone, right? Something's going to happen.
So Jasmine, you know what, when we think about the metaverse and being a new topic, another new one I think is live streaming, right? It sort of popped for us in the US over COVID. Everybody was more engaged. Do you think that's dead, or what do you think about live streaming?
I've always been a little skeptical of live streaming, even from the get-go. I mean, there was a lot of hype around it, and I do believe that there are many use cases for it, specifically when it comes to things like exclusive product launches or limited edition products. And especially when you're having live streams led by creators on social media or retail platforms, I think that there is, a lot of value in that and can drive awareness as well as sales. I don't see a world in which live streaming is going to become as big as it is in China, at least not in the near future. I do think that consumer behavior is just so incredibly different here in the US than it is in China. And even if we were to start using live streaming more frequently and use it more as a shopping mechanism, I still don't think we're going to have people sitting through 10-hour-long live streams and buying, as much as we see in terms of volume in China. That said, again, I do think that there are use cases for it, but I do think it's been a little bit overhyped. What do you think?
I mean, I agree with you in some ways, except for the overhype part. I think it's one of those things that brands need to get into, need to understand, but you're right, there isn't a use case for every single product. And part of the problem here for us in the US is we're not densely populated. The 15-minute delivery didn't quite work out for us here. It did during the pandemic. We didn't have another choice, but it is not margin friendly at all for retailers, so that they're pulling that back. And part of live streaming, I think, is this immediate gratification, right? You see it, you want it, and they can do that in China, and we're just not there yet here. So I agree that there are different sort of limitations in the US, but I do think it's something that brands need to think about, because it's just one more channel as we think about the consumer, and the consumer is everywhere and trying to buy everything on any particular platform of their choice. Live streaming is just one of those options.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right in that it is something that, that brands should be thinking about. But to your point about, that instant gratification, I think, one reason it works so well in China is because you can actually complete that purchase on the same platform. And that's something that we're not really seeing, at least in terms of social in the US. People aren't wanting to provide their credit card information to platforms like Facebook and Instagram, which hosted shoppable live streams and aren't hosting them anymore. So you can see that there has definitely been sort of a deceleration in this space. Again, social is just one area of the whole live streaming landscape, but it's the one that I'm most focused on, and I'm definitely seeing that it's slowing down a little bit in terms of momentum there. But unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you again to Susie, Jeremy, and Ethan for joining us, and a very special thank you to Walmart Connect for making this live audience Q&A possible. Our production crew behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for all of their hard work. Now, to close out the day with a little bit of fun, we'd like you to join us for a live interactive recording of our Behind the Numbers Reimagining Retail podcast with Susie and our podcast hosts, Marcus Johnson and Sarah Lebo, and some other special guests. You can join them by clicking on the tab below the video, which says Next Session. I also want to remind you that all of today's sessions are already available on demand. You can watch them again or share them with your colleagues. You'll also receive a quick survey in your email today where you can share feedback about your experience. We truly appreciate your comments and will use them to make future summits even better. And finally, look out for information soon about our next Attention Summit on June 2nd, which will focus on streaming and the new digital ad economy. Thank you again for joining us today, and I'll see you at the live podcast taping.